So I want to introduce Zaid very briefly, and then I'm going to let him credentialize himself. I had the privilege of class with Zaid back in the 2010s.
2018, something like that.
2018. At that time, I was lecturing in strategy development in the fall, and then business design in the winter. So I had the privilege of continuity between those two classes with that. Since then, Zaid is obviously a graduate and continues in his career in advertising. I got it wrong on Monday night. I said marketing. It's not, it's advertising.
That's right.
Zaid and I had many conversations down in what used to be the old Strategic Innovation Lab about a project that he was looking at for his MRP, which was around the communication of systems and how communication of systems could be improved. So I consider Zaid to be a peer. I consider Zaid to be an expert learner. And Zaid's here today to share with you the results of his learning journey with David in Systems Thinking Ontario with a very specific systems changes learning project. And so I'd like you all to give him a very warm welcome. Please welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Really honored to be here yet again, or lecturing again. I was in this very room like not too long ago, so it feels like kind of like surreal to come back full circle. A little bit about myself, as Stephen mentioned, I'm a graduate of the SFI program. Prior to that, I was born in Belleville, Ontario, kind of small town. My dad worked at Nortel, which was like a Canadian institution here. Grew up most of my life in Ottawa. And then I don't know if I can still say that sentence as time goes on. And I've been spending more time in Toronto. We'll see if I hit the halfway mark. But started working in the advertising industry. And that's where I had a knack for like strategy development. And the really funny thing about entering the SFI program for me, doing that in my day job, was I actually learned what I did in my day job at SFI. So I would learn like the language. I was like, oh, that's what we do at work. I didn't know it was called stakeholder mapping or positioning or whatever. So it was really interesting. And that was like provide a really like enriching learning experience. I often find myself like, if it's of help, like a little bit removed from like, I'm not trying to get the best mark in the course. I'm just trying to like learn a little bit. So I was always like appeasing the different dynamics of the team, like just like straight down the middle. I'm like, let's do a little bit of A, a little bit of B, and call it a tie. And so the systems course was part of that program. And I have always been like, I was really looking forward to it. And, I looked up to Peter Jones even prior to coming to the course, and it was a fantastic course. And for me, it was, again, like it gave me the language to describe what I felt I was already doing or starting to learn a little bit more about, like looking at the world through different lenses and appreciating a bigger picture and trying to see how there are connection points between everything in life. It really is like, and so I caught that virus. I caught the systems bug, and I haven't been immunized since then. And so that bug kind of continued in a journey, and I'll share more in the slides with David Ng, who was guest lecturing in that course, and we built a relationship through there, and I kind of started on a project. So what I'll share with you is a little bit of an introduction to that project of that research. It's titled Thinking with Time. And you'll see that theme come up throughout the presentation. And it's a brief introduction to what is formerly known as systems changes learning. I say brief because this is not the deep dive. If you want the deep dive, I'm sure you might have saw the readings produced by David Ng for his PhD dissertation. This is more of just an introduction to some of the concepts and some of the groundwork that lays the foundations of this way of thinking. Okay, so as I mentioned, I was sitting where you all once sat. And so this is kind of an opportunity for me to reflect on what would I tell my past self when learning systems. So I'm keeping that in mind. I'm trying to put myself back in your seat and kind of look at the lecture through that lens. And from what I understand, there's a little bit of a systems overload happening, right? Like you all have every week, there's like a new topic and a whole bunch of content and systems theories to learn. So I can empathize with that, having gone through it. I will say, don't worry about understanding everything in this or every detail. Take whatever you find that's helpful, like, oh, that's helpful, grab a little bit. And if you don't understand it, it's okay. There's a lot of time after you've graduated to continue learning. And that's what got me through the SFI program. I was just like, okay, certain percentage of the reading's great. Let's see what I can revisit after. Trust me, you'll feel so much better once you graduate and you're able to return to the readings or those bodies of work. If there is one single-minded takeaway, this is what I want you to take away from the lecture. And really, it's about thinking, when you think of systems or change or the nature of change, can you think of time first and space second? So really giving priority to thinking about the nature of change as time and through the lens of time. That's it. That's the takeaway. Okay, lecture done. So there's kind of four concepts or four sections I'll go through. One is a little bit about the background context to how we got to this topic and this angle of systems thinking. The next is about theory, maybe not too deep in the theory, so I'm just wrapping it as concepts, just a couple of key concepts that I'll break down. It's not thorough, it's not everything. The third section is a little bit about our methods and just a gesture to some of the case studies that we've done. And the fourth is the implications that some of the learnings that I've had on this journey that I feel like I can impart and share with you all if it's of benefit, and another like takeaway for how you can actually use this, or one single thing you can do to use this concept of systems thinking. Is that snap crackle pop from my connection?
No, I
Oh,
don't think so.
okay.
I think I missed that.
Oh, the volume, yes. Good systems analysis, looking at the full structure. So the background and the context of where we're coming from. Oh yeah. So I completed the systems course in 2017. And then in 2018, I started a deeper discussion with David Ng. I remember I was like, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about systems. He's like, I'm at the Jazz Festival. If you want to come and chat, I was like, okay. Kind of interesting. Just hang out, chat systems at the Jazz Festival. Maybe it was befitting. And then in 2019, I somehow agreed to joining a 10-year project to rethink systems thinking, and that's what was titled Systems Changes Learning. So the discussion went to David was mentioning this to myself and to some other folks. Can you commit like 90 minutes once every 3 weeks? It's like, why every 3 weeks? Well, 2 weeks is too short and 4 weeks is too long. So how about every 3 weeks? Like, maybe, I think so. Okay, how long can you do that for? How about 10 years? I'm like, I guess, let's see. So here we are. We're now in year 7 of that. So fast forward to 2025, we're in year 7 of a 10-year project. And so at this point, we're able to start to explain some of the concepts a little bit better. In the early days, it was really deep theory and it was quite a confusing journey. But now we're at a stage where we can start to like share that a little bit more. At that time when we were having conversations, there was a rising interest in systems change, and that was both at the local and national level. So you have large organizations like the OECD and more locally McConnell Foundation, UNDP, Center for Social Innovation Review, all kind of talking about systems change. And this is continuing kind of the buildup of interest towards systems thinking, but actually applying it to the systems change field. And looking at different frameworks and methods of how to go about policy changing systems. And along with that rising interest, if you just Google search like systems change, like you get so many different models, right? So there's just been a plethora of like so many different frameworks and toolkits and models that have come out. And so we were observing this happening, and David has a great knowledge of the history of systems thinking, and there's different strands of it as you might be learning in the course. And so we had a question to ask ourselves, which is, how would you approach systems change when there's no pause button? And it was a different way of looking at the system, which is like, if it's moving through time and you can't actually freeze it or stop it, how would you approach it then? And a lot of the models that we were looking at had this notion of capturing and documenting and just having a static picture of it. So we were kind of wondering this conceptual shift. And so that brings us to some of the theory and the concepts. So there's one premise that this is built upon, and there's three kind of concepts. So 4 things I'll go through in total. The premise is the aspect of time, which I mentioned in the title. So this is where we see reality as dynamic rather than static, and that allows us to emphasize time over space. And so what we mean by that is about seeing the world as made up of processes moving through time. And so we emphasize that most fixed structures, such as even something like a mountain, is actually a slow moving process. So this is a big shift in how you might see the world. Literally, we might see the world in these large scale things like a mountain or some type of large scale structure, whether it's physical or otherwise. And we think about it as like, that's fixed. That's just the world I'm born into, and that's the way it is. But if you start to shift your perception and start to see it as a process, it really opens up the aperture for different approaches to the nature of change, to how you go about change. And so what we do is then we downplay the perception of reality as snapshots in time, right? So this idea of I'm going to freeze my perception of the system, make some adjustments, and then unfreeze it and send it back out into the world is something that we're not saying it's wrong. We're just offering an alternative approach to it. So it has its benefits, and you can see that in maybe hard systems or physical systems. But we're kind of emphasizing seeing the world as a process. And this is drawn off of an anthropologist, Tim Ingold. He has this book on the temporality of the landscape. So looking at the landscape as something that's moving. There's a time lens to it. Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn also has that as well. I'll come back to him. But really, this draws upon anyone from the process philosophy of process ontology. So that body of work is what we're drawing on. So that's the premise that the next 3 concepts sit on, this idea that we see the world as dynamic, as a process moving through time. So the first concept that opens up is this idea of rhythms. And it's about understanding the natural rhythms of a living system. And so here we have the idea that all living systems have a natural inherent rhythm to them. So something that's kind of moving through time. And so we emphasize our system of interest as kind of like a thread moving through time. And it has this cadence. It has this maximum and minimum that it might go through. This might be the energy that you feel throughout the course of a day, the 24 hours of a day. It might be the peak of the sun or the peak of the moon. So there's various kind of aspects to all the natural living systems have this sort of rhythm. And it's inherent into the living system itself, right? It has its own, and you try to understand it as best as you can. And so we downplay understanding systems as a set of parts in a spatial configuration. So again, we're seeing a system moving through time versus taking a picture of it and looking at a space and having all the different parts in an arrangement. And this is drawn again from Tim Ingold, so as I just mentioned, and also a lot of classical Chinese medicine or any philosophy of the body. I won't draw too much off of this just for like the purpose of the lecture, but David's here as well if we have any questions on that. But it's been a steep learning curve, and so there's a lot of ideas that we've been extracting from that and applying in this lens. So you have this idea of rhythms, and you think about a topic that's very relevant today, and I'm not trying to bring too much politics in, but it's all over the media and a lot of the conversations. So I was trying to think of something relevant. When you think of Canada, the democracy, the election system, every 4 years, there's kind of this aspect of like, there's a potential for change at it. And so even the organization, Elections Canada, who have to like literally put the physical ballots and count and stuff like that, they will soon be at their peak busyness, and then they will soon be declining, and then they'll start up again, et cetera. Or you could see that as the nature of change at a federal system, right? When is there an opportunity for change at its peaks and at its lows? I'm going to continue this little thread of the Canadian landscape of politics to illustrate some of the points. The second idea is contexture. So this is about understanding when the rhythms weave together, they kind of form this contexture. And that's an intentional word, it's not a typo. So the context and the texture kind of together. And so contexture is what your system of interest is weaved into when multiple systems kind of intersect in time. So they all kind of combine and they run through time and they start to form that. And so we emphasize like the larger fabric in a way that your threads or your system of interest is entangled with or influenced by. So this visual here, I'm not sure if David mentioned, but this is a visual of a Vietnamese fish market. And so you might ask, where is the fish market? And that might not be the best way of describing it. Rather, it might be when is the fish market. And so it occurs when all of the boats and the people selling their fish or their stock or their trading kind of all run into each other. All of their threads are kind of weaved in together and they're on the banks of the river. So they're influenced by the weather that day, the time, who shows up, what you're able to get. So it creates this unique way of looking at, as I mentioned, time first as a perspective of seeing when do systems kind of interact with each other and what is the fabric or what is the structure that they're putting. And so, yeah, it's a really fascinating example, especially from a different culture about like, okay, when can I go to the fish market and see what I can get? And it's interesting because they're literally on the riverbank and they are moving as they are going along. They're running into each other and exchanging and selling. And so with that, we actually downplay, having a neat system boundary that delineates between inside or outside. So in this case, anyone feeds into this can kind of be part of that. We understand the value of it in other system paradigms about having a boundary setting. But in this perspective, you start to blur that boundary and it really becomes an entanglement of what the knots are weaved into. And this is drawn from an academic named Peacock Lee. She's based in the UK. She has this concept of contextual dyadic thinking. Again, that draws off of some classical Chinese philosophy, but also socio-ecological systems, Emery and Trist, about, what's the environment, how turbulent is it, how's it affecting the context in which, an organization or a group of people operate in. And so when you think about the contexture that we're weaved into, a lot of the discussion today about the politics of where we are is drawn off of the contexture that we're weaved into with America, with our neighbors to the south. And so you can't really separate it. So much of what's happening today in terms of tariffs and discussions and things like that are all there. So it's very fascinating. I'm not sure if everyone knows the context of this photo. It was someone, as the tariffs were reaching their peak and Trump's rhetoric about Canada was there, someone in Burlington had a snapshot of a Canadian goose kind of having a battle with an American eagle. So it's kind of this iconic moment. All to say that we can't think of, for those in that space of the politics of Canada, we can't think about Canada without thinking about the United States. And so that's where we tightly into that fabric together, and their vibrations affect us through time as well. And so the last concept I just want to touch on here is this idea of propensity. Propensity is like the inherent potential for change in a particular situation. And so you think about that. You think about so you're a thread weaving through time. You've entered into this fabric, and now there's a potential for the nature of these weaves to like go somewhere to do something. And so the idea is that there's a unique situation and the contexture has a tendency towards change. So how you want to harness that or how you want to extract that is somewhat of a strategic maneuver. And so we emphasize exploiting the tendency towards a desired change when the living system's natural behaviors kind of interact or align. And so once again, fishing, I'm not sure if that's coincidence or we're just really into fish, but when you think about the tendency towards, firstly, if you think about time, you're going to think about what is the best season for fishing. So you may say, I'm going to go fishing in January, and that goes on a different route of how you're going to, how much you can expect, how much fish you can expect to catch, what are your types of approaches. And that for that reason, because it takes a long time, it might even be more of something of a buddy-buddy scenario where you go ice fishing, you spend hours together. If you're fishing, in this illustration, the tendency for a group of fish to be together just means you have a higher likelihood of potentially catching a fish. And the fish's nature is such that it is going to sample the bait. It can't help but nibble on it. And so you're waiting there for that moment in time when you feel the catch, the vibration, and then you want to reel it in. And so eventually one grabs it and there it goes. And so this idea about like, is the change that you're seeking, is it the right time to do it? And then have you identified the right place? And are you working with the nature of those living systems that you're working with? Do they have a tendency that you're going to use? And so this is in contrast to predetermining a desired change and pushing systems towards us, regardless of the time frame of the window of the opportunity, right? So this idea that says we see this outcome and we want to move it, and it may not be the right time, and it's going to take tons of energy, and it may not be the best configuration, but here we go. We kind of offer an alternative to thinking that way. And so this is drawn from Francois Jullien, The Propensity of Things. So he really has gone deep and extracted a lot of these concepts. And it goes back to some classical Chinese philosophy of Sun Tzu. But Francois Jullien used an example of like, the village struggles to move a boulder that's like impeding the waterway. And so rather than trying to exert and push it, what happens when the propensity of water, when it's dammed? So when you dam the water is only going to come gushing forward once you break that. And once you break that, it can move the boulder with much more force. And so that's the concept of like, there's an inherent way in which that water will behave when it's dammed. And so maybe more of on this theme of a reflection of like the propensity of this moment, right? Like looking at it through time, what is occurring when all of these are lined up? When there is a new president, when there is a new, a premier in Ontario for us here in Toronto, Ontario, and of course, a new prime minister. So each of them have a tendency towards something, and everyone's trying to guess what that is. That's part of the politics. But the propensity of this situation is very interesting. What captures my attention is if I was advising, the fellow on the right here, the Liberal Party, that you've heard of the Trump bump. So this idea that Trump's rhetoric then drives people towards a certain political affiliation. Well, there is some propensity. It's a natural inclination for Canadians to feel rallied behind, a common cause. So do you want to extract? Do you want to harvest the most of that? If you do, you might even get a little, not Machiavellian, but a little counterintuitive. You might actually want to turn up Trump's rhetoric so that you benefit. It kind of leads to some funny alignments, if you will. I'm not saying literally you should do that, but it's just a funny way of exercising the strategic thought about the propensity of things. So those were kind of the concepts, just an introductory level about what happens when we think about systems changes through the lens of time. We have this idea of seeing systems as living rhythms, moving through time, and those all intersect and they weave into a contexture. And that contexture has a natural propensity to go a certain way. And it's about understanding what that is. And so the third section is a little bit about, so a lot of that was about the theories and concepts, and these metaphors are all great, but I think the question comes up, okay, great, very interesting. What do we do with that? How do we use it? What do we work with? So I'll give you a little bit about, what we're working with in that regard in terms of methods and a case study that we use. So the introduction to the methods is revisiting the pace layering. So this is a Stuart Brand work. And this is that understanding like the stack and the speed of change you're working with. So Stuart Brand has this idea of like looking at, how buildings learn, or looking at the site of a home. You could conceive, and so there's different paces, the site is fixed, the structure is slow moving, etc. And the stuff is perhaps the quickest to move. So you could look at your living space and you could say, I'm going to move the furniture around, shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. Okay, easy to do. But if you really want to make an arrangement to a different room structure and you need to move some of the physical structures or the piping, that's a whole different ballgame, right? Then you have to actually look at how many resources, investments, and time that do you have. So this idea about over time, there's different layers of change. And he was just making it relatable to the home. It was really fascinating. And he kind of extends that idea. I'm not sure if you've all seen this to the pace layering. Overall at a more like civilizational level. Now we can debate whether or not and this time and day, like these are in the right order. But the point is, again, is that there are paces of change that move faster and slower. So at the top, you have fashion. So that's kind of like going all over the place. Sometimes fashion moves backwards, sometimes forward, but it's changing dynamically, moving quickly. And at the very bottom, you have nature, which is kind of like the slowest layer, right? It's just going to be moving slowly over time, and you can't really speed that up. And Stuart Brand also says something to the effect of like the slower paces allow the stability for the faster paces to like innovate or adapt and forward. So this is the idea that we draw off of when it comes to thinking about the methods that we want to deploy. So we had this idea, it's a little bit of a rebranding that we're going through. It was called the hub and four spokes model. There's a hub, there's four spokes, but we're calling it pacing changes. So we're kind of like getting into the methods now. There's not necessarily a sequence to go through, but all of these hubs have a set of questions, and it continuously goes back to knowing from within, and then you kind of go back out and you go to these branches. It's challenging with methods because you don't want to suggest a literal approach, but you also want to provide some way of giving guidelines to how to use it. But the basis of it is on getting change makers to ask better questions about the nature of change they're working with. So our approach so far has been question oriented. Can we get even to the point of getting, the person we're consulting to be the one to ask better questions? So it really is a dialogic so far. We might evolve that, but it really is about the nature of the questions that we're asking about change. I'm going to emphasize reordering pacing. That's kind of the way we're coming into it. So on this one, this is the starting point about like, what are the commitments for doing more or faster? And what are the commitments for doing less or slower? So sometimes when you go into engagement, you might say, what's the system you're working with? What's the space? What are the variables? Another maybe working from the end backwards is to say, what do you want to speed up and what do you want to slow down? And it just starts to help the mind think about the nature of time in the way that we're looking at it. And we can kind of more easily ease into this idea of looking at systems change through time. And so that, and a lot of these are like conversational starters, right? What do you want to speed up and what do you want to slow down? So even in our own lives, we can think about that and what effect that has. At the top, so the northern part, we have the recognizing the contextual influences. So this is about, what are the external changes that might disrupt your system? What external shifts are tightly or loosely coupled to your system? So just in the America-Canada example, we're very tightly coupled with the American governance system, and it affects us greatly. And what external trends do you expect to continue? So this is really about understanding the broader whole that you're inside. This is not dramatically different than a lot of the systems, a lot of the other systems work that you're all doing, but it does reframe it as the context, the contexture that you're weaved into. On the right here, we have diagnosing rhythmic disorders. This is another way I think is valuable to enter the conversation. So you might come in from reordering pacing on the left, or you might come in from diagnosing rhythmic disorders. And this one is about, is your rhythm off? Yes, no. Is it off a little bit? Is it off quite a bit? Are you just not feeling well today? Is something just like sore or whatever? Can you explain why your rhythm is off? And do you expect being off to last a long time, or is it just a periodical thing that goes away? I.e., is it gonna fix itself? So sometimes this is very helpful, especially at like an organizational level. It's like another way of saying these four questions, like what's feeling out of sync for you? What's not lining up? What's out of rhythm? It's like, the production team is not really aligned to the development team or something like that, or an organization. You have this issue quite a bit where different functions and departments pretty naturally operate at different rhythm. And the whole issue is when you have something that's out of sync. So, a production team is not ready to go to market or something like that. It could also be at the human level, right? You might not be feeling well that day or this time of year. It's like, actually, this happens to me every October. I get this type of cold or this headache. Not a big deal. I'll take some medicine. I should feel better. Or is it something that's really affecting you? Like my knee has been gradually getting worse and worse. Like I'm not sure. I've been playing a certain sport and it's having a greater effect. Maybe I should get that looked into. I don't know if this will go away. So when it comes to when you think about biology, sometimes it's helpful in this entire body of work of thinking about the biology of it all. And then at the bottom here, we have prognosing likelihoods. And a lot of people jump towards this step, having not done some of the other aspects of thinking. So that's why this is somewhat non-linear, circular, which is when is it a good time or bad time to make the change? So as I talked about in, say, the fishing example, you know, where in the landscape does this change work best? So finally, we come to a spatial question. First, it's when, and then secondly, it's where. Who likes this change and who doesn't, i.e. who's going to be affected positively and who's going to have to be acclimatized to that. So yeah, this is really about looking at what is the likelihood of what may happen given that change. So again, these are just like great prompts for conversations that we've been having, sometimes over coffee, sometimes it's just in chats. To understand, you know, how do people look at system change and getting them to think about it through time. Just for thoroughness, the center. So when you do any of these, you might come back to the center continuously. And you're asking, like, what's the system of interest that you can reasonably influence? Like, what are you working on, basically? And sometimes the question might push you off that, or it might help you define something more clearly. And what yin and yang processes are affecting your rhythm. You know, I might touch on that in the Q&A, but it's this idea that there's different forces that are, you know, materializing and dematerializing. So trying to understand that is critical. So that's the hub and four spokes, somewhat of a rebrand as pacing changes. And we kind of just like this idea of just the language of pacing changes, and it kind of gets you into thinking about the nature of time and change together. And so in March of 2022, David and the team had an engagement with the Canadian Digital Service through the Code for Canada group. And this is where we were piloting some of the questions. These were, you know, in their earlier stage. I mean, they might have been a little bit more refined or distilled in the previous slide, but you could see that, you know, a lot of groups were working through some of these questions and we were kind of looking at how helpful is it. And I think it's just really interesting how, you know, you look at this comment here, those working on it, or those in the workshop are answering this right column here, right? So here's a siloed approach, too much focus on getting things done, not enough doing things well in terms of quality, which I thought was interesting. And then they said, if we spend too much time doing things well, we won't get things done in a timely manner. And if we do things too quickly, then the quality suffers, so the public doesn't get a good experience. So you can kind of see that tension that's being extracted from this type of conversation of the constant pull between, are we spending too much time refining and developing the product, or are we actually trying to be in service of the customer, the end citizen, with what they need, and that this tension. So these are great ways to look at that lens, and you can even see the theme of time running through their answers, which we thought was really interesting and neat. So that was a wonderful engagement that we had. And so I'm going to jump a little bit to the implications. And these are a little bit more personal, some personal reflections about my own journey. So while there might be a little bit of a gap between 1, 2, 3 that we just talked about, I'm going to leap ahead to what this body of work, what has it done for me in terms of a designer and strategist? How has it changed my thinking? And if any of this is useful, or if any of this is, you know, it impacts you positively, feel free to take it away. Or if you just want to sit with it and say, let me see how that lands, that's totally fine. And so I come back to that idea of what would I tell my past self from learning systems. So this is me speaking to myself in the past, and if you benefit from it, I hope that's helpful. And so some of the mindset shifts from system changes learning that have shaped my stance as a strategist and designer. There's a couple of these, so I'll just go through them. The first one is, you know, getting to an absolute answer, moving from getting to an absolute answer, something that addresses all concerns and all issues, to, and I make up my own grammar just for fun, getting to the it depends-ness of a situation. There's kind of this idea of like, every situation has a, well, it depends. It depends. There's a it depends-ness of it that I'm trying to get to that quality. So thinking in context first has been a dramatic shift, right? I know I might hear a smart answer, a reasonable approach, and I might say, "Oh, that's interesting." But what was the context in which that answer lives, and how did that come about? And what variables were in play? And that's kind of the mindset that I've been approaching more. So, David said something interesting about like the questions interest me less. Sorry, the answers interest me less, and the questions interest me more. And so that's where philosophy is at. It's like the pursuit of better questions. So that's a little bit of a mind shift that has occurred to me since this time. This one is about being moving from being idealistic to pragmatic, and this one really this one's quite impactful because you might think about the values that you hold dear and the outcomes that you want to affect in your future or in the world around you. And I think about the aspect of being pragmatic when you think through the aspect of time, like where are the interests lining up? When is it the right approach to perhaps even make concessions or find alignment with people you might find distasteful? And that's been a big change in my stance, as I mentioned here. And I start to wonder about whether or not that is going to be increasingly a quality that's needed, especially on the large scale of time, where we all born, and everyone in this room born in a civilization at a time when there was this inherent alignment, but that's kind of being distorted now. So how do you navigate a world in which you're trying to find a realignment? And I think some degree of pragmatism may play a revived role in that regard. Remember that time, like when the tech stuff was really happening? It's like, does it scale? Does it scale, bro? Like, how does it scale? And now I'm more like, can we make it more local? Like, and this is not to say it's closed off, but like, how do we localize this? Like, what's the smaller version of it? Like, how does it have more meaning to those that are interacting with it, or those that have a deep influence with it? Again, you can kind of see the implication of this drawing off of like ideas of contexture and propensity and seeing the rhythm that we live through. And so I have, it's funny, like some of my own thoughts down this line are like, what would happen if we had the Toronto version of the internet? So you log on, it's not Google, it's like you log on, it's Toronto bounded. And you want to click, do you really want to navigate to the bigger internet? Warning, you're going to the wild, wild west. It's like, yes, okay. And then you can go there, like just a different way of like localizing our information ecologies and our relationships. I think we've been born, all of us, we've been born in a world that seemingly was unbounded, both in attention and in our interactions. And with a lot of the shifts underway, what does it mean to restore a local aspect? Does the local hold qualities that we might be looking for? And this one is about looking at the world of feeling the world, the time through the sense of a chronos, which is like more clock time, like, physics, etc., versus kairos, the felt time. So this has a deep implication about knowing yourself, knowing your own rhythm, and understanding, what are the durations or time spans that you work best in. Some of the architects actually exploit this. So you might have seen this, or you might have experienced this if you go to a certain room or building and the staircase swirls quite a bit, right? They just want you to spend time appreciating that space. Or if it runs over a lake and there's a path, it's going to go take the winding path because you're trying to like spring time down through the architecture of design. But also in an immaterial format, right? Our own sense of time and the feeling of time of when you're in the zone and how quickly or slowly things might go, and so on. This one's about moving from this idea of having lawful order, which is about law, the policy and rules, more towards negotiated order. So it's about more coordination, flexibility, even spontaneity. And when you think about this in a change-making context, a lot of the end results of advocacy and the change-making efforts, you'll notice they land in the legal victories of the policy change. And the shift for me has been, is that worth celebrating? Is that the right approach? Is there benefit to having a higher degree of the ability to negotiate order that you seek? and maybe not having so many compounding laws and frameworks. So the ability to have the flexibility with the people that you interact with to sort out what is an agreeable consensus to this issue that we're having or this conflict. And then that makes you think, and this is all weaved together, because that makes you think about the local, right? So, you might have the ability to have that when you are more localized. You can kind of see eye to eye or have those conversations. So this has been a big shift as well, just really moving my mindset off of like the victory of a policy change and more towards how do we create kind of social systems that have negotiated order built into them. This one's key about moving from designing the solution. So as a designer, we're kind of finding this elegant solution to designing, it's a lot of words here, but designing the multi-paradigm inquiry into the issue. So it's a bit of a meta container. This has been a shift for thinking of myself as, okay, let's design and let's find the right way to solve this complex issue. And even that's a paradox because you can't really solve it. But I think what the role of the designer is, and perhaps this is increasingly valuable today, is about designing that way of looking at the issue through multiple lenses. How many people can you reasonably bring into the room, or how many people can you actually look at it? How many different ways can you look at the issue? You're forced to having to remove yourself somewhat from the end outcome of it. But I think the value of the inquiry is what is more desirable now with the complexity that we're facing in social systems than having a solution. And we can kind of see that play out in the world around us when there are policies and laws that are completely unfavored or not of interest. And again, that touches to whether or not the locals are we being pragmatic about it? Is there a degree of negotiated order? So this multi-paradigm inquiry is really, it's changed how I think. So I might hear something in my information ecosystem, and I'm always wondering, how does it look like from another perspective? I can even entertain perspectives that I find distasteful, and sometimes it's like, why are you entertaining it? I'm like, no, I'm trying to go and harvest. I'm trying to gather the intel and bring it back. And lastly, I left this one for last because this has been my biggest one on this list, is about thinking about the designer's bias towards actions to doing less or just letting things run their course, maybe without intervening or intervening to a lesser degree. And I kind of titled this Humbling Design, right? Like, how do we bring design back? We start from the premise of design, or we start from this premise of like, okay, we need to take an action. And I wonder, can that have a rethought? Can we rethink that? Is there value in being a high quality, inquirer? In which case you might see that, if we intervene or if we do something, it may exacerbate the situation. It may worsen it. So the best thing we can do is just be hands off and just monitor it. And I understand, even in the context of a design education course, we're running through tools and exercises so that we can learn. But I've really taken this to heart since graduating. You start to see that out there. And I may be, TBD about RSD or the upcoming in the fall. I might try to deliver a presentation on what does that look like. I have this idea of like design as subtractive. What can you remove? And just take out some of the noise, take out some of the complexity, and just let things sit. So those were some of the major mindset shifts that this body of work has had on me since over the 7+ years since. And if there's the takeaway, if there's one thing you can do, so there's a lot, right? There's a lot of concepts, a lot of implications, a lot of takeaway, a lot of background, but there's one thing you can do to apply it literally in your coursework. Drum roll. Use verbs. Just use verbs. Just try it. It's nothing major, nothing dramatically different. We don't want you to change how you're developing any of your system models or things like that. But just try it out and see how it feels in your group work. So if you have some dynamic that's playing between a GPS system and a food delivery person, just add the verb, be like, decode or like understanding the information or watching or looking at the thing. So just add ing And there's always a joke here that perhaps it's befitting that the person who's developing the process philosophy on systems thinking is David Ng. So he's David Ng. And that's maybe a shortcut to remember. So just add the ing to almost like everything that you can think of. Try to do that as much as you can. Okay, so just a single-minded takeaway was when it comes to systems change, you know, can we think what happened? Can we think about time first and space second? Seeing you time. Okay.
Thank you. So, how would you like to engage with what you've just been blessed with?
I think it is really interesting for me to think about the idea of like not getting this straight away, because I feel like maybe not, I don't operate from like an idealistic mindset. I think I operate from like a fear-centric mindset where I think like if something isn't done now, it's only going to get done, it's only going to become worse.
Right.
So I think it's interesting to kind of like step back and like think about the possibilities for the best time of action rather than saying like right now it's the time you have to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very well said. I think one of the things that David brings up is you've heard the Hippocratic Oath, like for those who practice medicine, right? Like the first step is to do no harm. So you do not want to like make the patient situation any worse. If you can't, then it's kind of hands off. And so start to think about that philosophy of what that would look like for the design world, right? And I think you've captured that there now. Thank you.
I just wanted to say it's really resonating with me, and I feel like throughout the systems course, I've been thinking about how like humans are just like beings of nature, I guess. And like nature is a system, like there's like constant change and movement in that. So by like looking at systems and recognizing time and change, it's like you're almost breaking the illusion that we sometimes have that like we create our own world that is like separate from all of that like natural stuff. And it's just cool to think about like if you can bring this way of thinking into your work, you're always helping to like dismantle that illusion that humans might create their own like system within like separate from nature, but like things will always change.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even the machinery or even the control of time that we have in the chronos, right? Like we set the time, and someone mentioned previously, like we've changed daylight savings time, like we can move time. Well, not really, you're just kind of rearranging it. And I don't want this to, but you said something interesting that people themselves have a nature, right? And that enters a slightly interesting philosophical discussion about the nature of the bad parts of us as well. And being able to then attach the posture of non-intervention with understanding that there are some people who have a particular nature, that is unsettling, but also like, whoa, you got to like step back and look at that. And these are classic questions on the nature of evil or the nature. I mean, I don't want to go too dark in that way, but understanding that humans have a tendency to behave in certain ways. Not all are equal or not all in the same way. And how do you come to that realization while still holding true to what you believe or what is grounded? It's not an easy answer. And I think there's also a challenging side to that, to what you just said, to understand the nature of people. Yeah, go ahead.
I find this perspective of systems humbling. So something that I ponder on a lot is kind of from a human rights perspective, like when do certain things stop being acceptable?
Right.
And new standards come in, and I feel like very often, like when we're talking about things like power, progress, revolution, we're talking about the who. And I, like you brought up Mark Carney, like it's interesting. Everything had to happen, and there was a certain time and an ing and aim to it that had to sort of set the foundation to that. And it makes me think of some kind of more Eastern philosophies on like life and doing. So I come from a family that has like a very strong agricultural legacy. And like I learned from my dad that they would make decisions based on the stars,
Right.
which like is like kind of different than the astrology that we're doing, but people be like, no, it's not the time.
Yeah,
And then you strike the iron.
right, yeah.
So I think that's interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. And it makes us think about, as I mentioned, like the time that we all are born into, right? And these ideas about progress and where we are is perhaps just a circumstance of where we are in the life cycle of today. And that might not be the case in the future. It wasn't the case in the past. So it really starts to center that idea of like, sometimes people say like, you know, you should know who you are. And I kind of play with that. I'm like, you should know when you are. When you know when you are, then you might be able to like reconfigure yourself.
And where you are.
And where you are. Yeah,
Thank you so much. I really like the presentation. I always think the system is really related to what I'm doing. I'm doing architectural design. So, and particularly what you mentioned that what we learned here actually carrying out what we do every day. Basically, I do it for like 10 years.
Right.
Now I kind of like systematically understand what I'm doing every day.
yeah,
Very interesting. Especially when your takeaway and your application, I can feel that our office, slightly different from other architecture design firm, is like kind of like related to maybe 80% of what you mentioned.
oh yeah, okay.
Although we haven't to there to for the harboring design yet, because the class hire us as an expert.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we go
Yeah.
that we are not really driving the design,
Yeah,
it would be quite difficult to justify why they pay us.
yeah, I get that.
So I'm a little bit difficult there.
Yeah. That is like the key question, which is like, if anyone figures this out here, is like, how do we get people to pay us to tell them to do nothing or to do less? That's what I'm trying to work on. So it's like, if anyone can crack that, I'm in on it. But that's, yeah. So I hear you on humbling design as a paradox. It's like, show us your credentials. Where our credentials are, we don't really tell you too much to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the lecture. That was super interesting, and seeing kind of that knowing from within and your different entry points on the two ways of diagnosing the problem or rethinking about leasing. And then the link that you said to doing nothing or doing less, sorry, really resonated with me at my last job. We were working on strategies of the organization to figure out like our strategy at the corporate level in consideration of the divisional strategies of everybody and
Right.
getting their plans. And it's like, whoa, you want to do all this in 12 months plus your job, like with
Yeah.
what time? And so the approach we also took was considering like, what can we do less of?
Yes.
What are we doing today that is it really bringing value? Is it really making people happy when they do it? It's not really contributing, it's just like busy work. And
Yeah.
so by eliminating some of that stuff, we start to redesign or replace
Wow.
the other work is done.
Oh, amazing. Can you say more about that process? Like, what did it look like when the decision came to do less, and how did you get people on board with that?
So that, of course, as always, in the questions I've been asking this semester is there's like the theory and then there's the real life.
Right.
Because we're faced with, we don't know your job, right? So
Yeah.
you are telling me what you do, and then if we ask, what can you do less of? Well, nobody wants to say I'm doing these things that are not adding value.
Right.
They want to preserve their jobs,
Right.
they want to preserve,
Yeah,
the illusion that they're bringing so much value. So
yeah,
of course, in execution is where, it was a bit difficult to actually get people to say like, okay, these 3 tasks I do every day can be eliminated. But there are some things that we're able to do from like a corporate level or system level. So, this whole process, let's just get rid of that.
wow. That's really impressive. You don't hear that very often, actually. It's always additive.
Yeah.
And so thank you for sharing that. And I think there's a theme there I've been thinking about a lot, and even what you mentioned about the architectural firm is like, is so much of our additive nature just justification for jobs or position or doing something as it is and start to think the answer is yes. And so then the key becomes there, maybe in this scenario is about being clear-sighted about what's actually adding value versus like accepting things as they are, as a, this is the position and we have to preserve it, etc. But not easy given the momentum that's already moving.
So we tried to do something similar in healthcare, and as a physician group, everyone had been bringing up like meeting flow, and the idea that our
Right.
calendars are just totally
Yeah.
full, and so our division director, my boss, actually had said, okay, all of you, I want to see 30% less meetings. Like, I want you to take 30% out, just do it, which I liked the idea of, but the problem is, right, you could maybe do that if you're working within one division. We can only
Right.
30% of our divisional meetings, sure, but all of us exist and most of our meetings are with external. And so
Yeah.
it became problematic, and honestly, if we were gonna do something like that, but at this, like the hospital level.
Oh, wow.
You know,
Yeah.
which, you know, a propensity, right, the inherent
Right.
to change that, you know, it wasn't there at the time. So
Right.
I liked how you, yeah, anyways, put this together, really nice picture.
What would have worked in that scenario if there was a major slowdown in the entire hospital and then there was a reduction, might that have stuck?
Maybe. I mean, it was interesting, because they looked in, someone did a really kind of nice study just within the hospital looking at pre and post pandemic, and we have added so many more meetings on. And we
Post-pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah, okay.
absolutely. And part of it was we slowed down in healthcare to try to build capacity, you know, like for patients, and then in all reality, once that we had time, and then things just got added into the time, right? Because, you know, we were in the operating rooms, for instance, so the surgeons just filled up a million different like meetings and like
Right.
research and lab stuff that just continues
Yeah.
to take things away. So what they tried to do is force us to say, just cut it out, just do it. Which I like the idea. Honestly, I did it. Okay, this is great. I mean, I like the excuse. So sorry,
Yeah.
that's 30%. Nope.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's really interesting. And I think about, you know, another way of framing it is like, what can you slow down versus doing less of? Because then slowing down gives you the breathing space to figure out what can move, right? So but conceptually, it's really challenging for those in the decision makers and those kind of managerial positions who understand their incentives are not to slow down and not to stop. And in fact, their dashboard has alarm bells going off if something pauses. So it's fascinating.
So can you bring up the
Sure.
basic changes methods? Because I think this goes directly to what Seth has shared. When I looked, if you go back to, if you look at the diagnosing of rhythmic disorders, the 4 questions here are framed as individual questions, like personal questions. And I just thought that the same questions need to be asked of the organization.
Yeah.
Because organizations do have rhythms. You know, when I taught business design, I used to talk a lot about business cycles. Like there are cycles that the business goes through, you know, so, you know, take an example. My wife's business is Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire has a seasonal business called Christmas. And so that Christmas seasonal business is planned fully 12 months ahead.
Yeah.
And all the purchasing for Christmas is done 12 months ahead. And so there's a particular business cycle for that particular set of merchandise.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, you know, when you're diagnosing these rhythmic disorders, there's kind of, you know, you can look at, you know, what are the essential organizational rhythms and what are perhaps some of the artificial rhythms.
Yeah.
Right. And I love the conversation, you know, at the outset, you said, you know, David asked you if you could spend 90 minutes
Right.
every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Not every 4 weeks, not every 2 weeks, but he kind of set the rhythm there. And I thought that's a useful way of looking at it.
Because what you're gesturing at, Stephen, is like understanding what's sustainable.
Yeah.
Because you can sprint all you want, but you're gonna get gassed out in 5 minutes, right?
Yep.
And so in a hospital, it's like, what does that look like when everyone's working those intense shifts? And sometimes that's needed in the case of an emergency, right? Like you need, yeah. It's really fascinating when you look at the rhythm perspective of the organization design. Other questions, comments, reflections even? Yeah.
Yeah, just say like, I was been wrestling with this for a while because it's like, I think of like physics, right? Systems is like light or particle, it's both, right? Wave or particle.
Right.
So I'm almost like, because this is totally useful, and I was even just piggybacking off what was done. It's like you have to find the words to even impart into the paradigm shift, because I also tried to streamline, like in media, television is very, very, very streamlined. It's very like military down to the second, but and then there's film use cases, but the two are not actually very far off. So I was actually proposing like a marriage between the two, and the two systems where you can streamline, have the speed of television and the skill of film and the output of film, but it was very hard to get traction because that was such a paradigm shift that people are like, no, like this won't work, even though it's like actually technically it's very feasible, we could do it today. But how do you speed up even the system's language within the people around you in order to get the buy-in to do the R&D and potentially change the rhythm? But the reason why I say this is because I'm almost thinking like, how can you integrate the wave and the particle approach, like the static, while also, kind of faster than time. So you can have like that rich picture of everything that's going on, potentially not everything, but as much as you conceptualize.
Yeah. I think part of what we think in this approach is not the elimination of the space, what's the particle. It's about maybe shifting our attention to thinking about the wave first, or time first, and then the space second. So is it the right time? And if it is the right time, then you may want to map out or look at where, So we talk about it as when before where, but it's not that there is no where. You do have to actually have a space where you're working within.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so then at the center of this, it says knowing from within. And I guess the question is, within what? Is it within the individual? Is it within the small group? Is it within, the local community? Is it like, does the knowing from within have a scale, or is it intended to be at a certain point?
So it's of the group that is working through it. So it could be any of those. It could be an individual working through their own dietary change. It could be the family household. It could be the community or the organization. And so this just comes from the idea that, there's a classic saying that change won't happen unless it comes from within. So there is a certain degree of truth to that of, are you learning? Is the inside learning, whether it's the individual or the larger group. So this can kind of stretch and be adapted to. And I think part of that is the idea of like, who are these folks, right? Who are the people that are learning, who that is? And I don't know, David, if you want to share a little bit about this question we always had, which is like, those that kind of show up, or those that you have around you, that is what it is, and that those are who it is. And that has to do with like the local aspect of working with what is available right now. And so you may not have the affordance of having everyone together. And so are you learning and potentially even sweeping in more people as you go, or organizations or departments or whatever have you?
And so, I'm just going to extend that.
Sure.
It sounds to me like this knowing from within includes a shared the primacy of a shared sensibility of time.
Yes.
So how do we share the sensibility around when is the right time?
That's a very good, well said. Yeah.
That would become like a sort of like a shared place of being for
Mhm.
those who are choosing to act together
Yeah,
or not act.
right, yeah. And perhaps that's where there's a lot of, you start with a lot of differences on understanding that sense of time, because everyone brings their own conception of it in towards the issue at hand. And yeah, very, very well said. I think that is a key observation.
And I bring that up because I know that one of the core struggles here in the SFI program is that when we configure you guys in teams, we're creating a new relational system, new system of relationships. And so if we could go to your mindset shift. One of the challenges that you have in working with one another is figuring out how do we link together, like if you all had a strong sense of your own kairos, your own felt time, which is often culturally inculcated, okay? Or has a cultural dimension to it, but if we all work at our own, we have a good strong sense of our kairos, then that can present a challenge, because in those then, how do you then sync up 4 different experiences of felt time? And then layer on the incredible workload from the kairos and the deadlines for your group, right? That's a very, very challenging thing to face as a brand new system of relationships. Because you then go through that model, forming, storming, norming, performing. Right? Just, I don't know about you, but from the time I was very, very young, my own kairos or sense felt of time was never respected. Was never respected. Parents and elders and adults got to dictate the rhythm on which things happened. And so for me personally, recovering my own sense of kairos, it didn't happen for me until I was late in my 30s. It was like finally I landed back and I had denatured enough of the training and the parenting and all of the scripting to actually connect with my own sense of kairos. And when I got there, I was like, oh my God, this is where I'm supposed to be living from. And so I think many people actually live from a place of alienation from their own felt sense of time. They don't actually have a direct connect to it, which is really, really challenging. Because so much of what we do is so sped up. And that's a real issue. And so what I love about what Zaid has brought to us today is time first, space second. And so if you can work with that meditation, like where are you in relationship to time, your own rhythm, your own pacing? And what do you need to do to respect your own sense of time and your own sense of rhythm? So that when you actually enter into co-creative relationships with others, not the forced ones that are jammed into this class, but when you get to choose, how you'll know how to choose. If you have a clear sense, you'll know when you meet someone who you think, oh, I think their rhythm and my rhythm will couple nicely. We might be able to meet on every 3rd beat or every 4th beat, right? But if you really take this in and you think about rhythms, you think about your own sense of time, it's a whole new way of approaching your creative process. I really feel like what's been shared here from this research, I mean, it's like when Zaid shared it on Monday night, there was things that just went click, 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 right? They tumble out. So even on this slide, there's two examples to take away from. I'm going to start with the bottom one. The designer's bias towards action, letting things run their course without intervening, humbling design. I taught the entirety of the strategy design course, one term. And then at the end of the term, one of the students came up to me, it's Kevin Morris. I don't know if you guys know Kevin Morris. Kevin Morris came up to me and goes, here's a book for you. And it was called Strategy Without Design. And the whole hypothesis of that book was that orchestrated top-down strategy actually erodes the intrinsic innate strategies that are being enacted at the periphery of the organization. And that in a large-scale organization that is given permission to adapt, that there are localized adaptive strategies that are far more effective than a so-called top-down strategy. So I want to give you that thought, because this notion of humbling strategy design is an important concept, right? When we think about strategy and intervening, how can we take that humbling approach? So there's that, and then the other one I want to offer to you, because Zaid mentioned it, and it's an artificial cycle, and that's the artificial cycle of electing our officials every 4 years. Why is it 4 years? Who said it should be 4 years? Where does that come from? Right? And that 4 years is really problematic, because what happens is the policy agenda gets enacted usually in the first 2 years. And then there's a bit of a pause to see how the people are liking that policy agenda. And then the last year of those 4 years is basically getting ready for another election. Right? And so there's built into that 4 year cycle, there are different phases that we see all the time. And it's not helpful. How do you solve a long-term problem like sustainable energy on a 4 year election cycle? Right? Now we've got the Fed scrapping the carbon tax. Right? So what was meant to be an incentive to move us forward towards sustainable energy is now being scrapped. And so what I loved about so many of these mindset shifts that has identified is that, you know, if you look at innovations in democracy, have you guys heard of deliberative democracy? Deliberative democracy, I hope, is our future. But in deliberative democracy, you're actually working locally, you're actually working pragmatically, and you're convening the citizenry to actually look at a policy issue or a policy need, a social need, to get to a negotiated order using and using the acquired method that you're describing, right? And so when you look at these shifts that Zaid's exploring or is making, these are also the kinds of shifts that need to be happening societally for us to actually get to a more authentic form of deliberative democracy, where the people are actually saying, yes, we think the policy agenda should be this. And the politicians could say, yes, I'll stand for that policy, whatever it might be. So I just wanted to offer those reflections, because there's so much, this is such a rich space. We could almost switch the, you know, looking for systems in the wild to looking for rhythms or cycles or
rhythmic processes.
Rhythmic processes in the wild. I think that would be an equally valid inquiry. And which ones are truly natural per Hannah, right? Which ones are the natural cycles versus which are the artificial ones? And how is it that these artificial ones are driving things?
Wonderful.
More food for thought. Okay, any closing observations, comments, insights? All right, well,
Yeah, there's a fun. Sure.
I guess you mentioned really briefly that you work in advertising, so
Yeah.
I guess at a really high level, you found a way to break this.
That's a good question. My answer is more no than yes. More that I haven't than I have. I'll start by saying I actually have a conflicting relationship with that aspect of my work, and maybe you can tell that from the way I think versus maybe what I do. I work in like a part-time capacity, so I'm not like full-time engaged with it. Oh, that's perhaps an answer. Is like the rhythm that I have come to is because I work in a part-time capacity, I'm able to get away, I guess I am recording this, no one should hear this, but I'm able to get away with like, the same thing that a full-time person, a full-time FTE may have as responsibilities. I'm not, I can kind of skirt around that. And that allows me the flexibility to come to OCAD to lecture, for example. And so I've adjusted my rhythm, or I've renegotiated my rhythm that I know how I work best with what's available. And the timing was that I actually tried to do that in 2019, believe it or not, before COVID, and it couldn't work out. Like me and I tried it because, and then obviously post-COVID, it was like more than natural for that to be the case. So perhaps without thinking it consciously, I have been able to find it in the configuration, but in the actual substance of the work, I think it does affect, when I say mostly no, maybe not explicitly, maybe I'm not like, let's think rhythmically, but I think it does affect the way I think about the timing of certain like campaigns or developments, or even the way like your client might be behaving. So there's like a March 31st fiscal cutoff, right? And a lot of their clients. So then, Stephen, maybe you run into this. Everyone wants to blow their budget before, right? So you start to, as much as you're thinking in rhythms, you start to perhaps know that you have to respect other people's rhythm or other organizations, even their artificial rhythm. And that helps you say, are you really going to push all your energy fighting uphill this battle, or will you maybe let that one go, take the hit, but then get a victory somewhere else that works better for you? So I've almost reallocated my energy in that way. But your question just made me think about those. I hadn't thought of it, so thank you for that.
That's why I have a hard time saying.
Mhm.
It means that like, I just have the upfront term, I need to be like, all about school and.
Yeah.
The amount of energy and thought that you like dedicate or like allocate to work.
Right. 100%. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. What industry are you working in?
I work for a tech startup, I'm a designer.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.